Freddy the Pig to and again. Chapter 13. Now after the adventure with the alligators, the animals rested for 2 days, and then they went on seeing the sights of Florida. They made a great many pleasant friends among the natives, and even Mr. and Mrs. Webb made the acquaintance of a number of very interesting and agreeable spiders, with whom they discussed fly-catching and compared notes on weaving and other matters of interest. But at last, one morning when they awoke, the sky was full of flocks of birds, the bluebirds and blackbirds and red wings and yellow hammers and purple grackles, all flying steadily northward. And then they knew that spring had come, and it was time for them to be starting back home. "Well, I for one shall be glad to get back," said Mrs. Wiggins. "We've had a grand time traveling, but home's a pretty good place. The snow is all gone by this time. I expect Mr. Bean is getting ready to plant his potatoes and corn and cabbages. And the old elm by the barn is all covered with buds," said Charles. "And the ice is gone on the duck pond," said Alice and Emma. "And Mr. Bean will need me to help him with spring plowing," said Hank. "Come along, animals," said Freddy. "Let's start." And so they said goodbye to Florida and started home. They had been traveling for about a week when they came one morning to a big field which was all heaped with tin cans and old shoes and ashes and rubbish of all kinds. They were prickly thistles growing in the fields, and a goat was eating them. "Good morning, goat," said Freddy. "Good morning, pig," said the goat. "Have a thistle. They're delicious." "No, thanks," said Freddy. "Have you ever eaten one?" asked the goat. "No," said Freddy. "They never looked very good to me." "You'd be surprised," said the goat, "how tasty they are. Just take a nip of this big one here." Freddy didn't want to try the thistle, but he was always very polite and didn't like to hurt the goat's feelings, so he took a large bite. As soon as he had eaten the bite, he wished he hadn't. The prickles tickled his nose horribly and stuck into his tongue, and he coughed and sneezed and squealed and grunted and ran round and round in circles while the other animals laughed, and the goat looked at him in surprise, and at last he got it out of his mouth. "I'm very sorry," said the goat. "Perhaps there was something the matter with that one. Now here's a nice one, or perhaps you'd rather have a bit of old boot. There were 2 fine ones left here yesterday. I've eaten one, but—" "No, thank you," said Freddy firmly. "Some people say a pig will eat anything, but really, one must draw the line somewhere, and I draw it at old boots." "Well, well," said the goat, with a sigh. "There's no accounting for taste. I hoped that I might persuade you animals to settle down and live here with me, but of course, if you don't like thistles or boots—" "We don't," said Mrs. Wiggins, "any of us." "Then that settles it," said the goat sorrowfully, "because there's really nothing else here. I like it, but it's very lonesome. No one to talk to all day but the stupid cart horse who brings the rubbish here to be dumped. And I do like good conversation." He was so lonely that the animals spent the rest of the day with him and told him of their travels. Just as they were leaving, late in the afternoon, a farm wagon came along, piled high with rubbish. It belonged to a man who was moving into another house, and he had brought all the stuff that he didn't want to keep. He was going to throw it on the dump heap. On the very top of the load was a funny old-fashioned carriage. The man threw the rubbish out of the wagon, carriage and all, and drove away. "Must be some boots in that lot," said the goat, licking his lips, and began poking round in the heap. But Jinx and Freddy had walked over and were looking at the funny old carriage. They talked together in undertones for a few minutes, and then Jinx said, "Hey, Hank, come here. Do you suppose you could draw this carriage?" Draw that? Said Hank indignantly. I've drawn heavier wagons than that many the time. Oh, I know you can draw it, said Jinx. What I mean is, can you draw it the way it is, without any harnesses and straps and all things? No, said Hank. I'd have to have a collar and traces and bridle and a bit. Oh, we don't know what any of those things are, said Jinx. And anyway, we haven't got them. But here's an old piece of rope. Suppose we could tie that to the handles of the carriage and put it over your shoulders. Could you draw it then? Why, I won't say I can't, said Hank. But what do you want the carriage for anyway? If you can draw it, said Jinx, we can put the gold that we found in the ant house in it and take it back to Mr. Bean. Hank thought this was a fine plan, so Freddy got the rope and Jinx tied it to the handles of the carriage. All the cats are good at tying knots. The stupidest cat can tie 50 knots in a ball of yarn in 2 minutes. And if you don't believe it, ask your grandmother. So this was easy for Jinx. And then they looped the rope over Hank's shoulders, and he pulled the carriage up onto the road. The carriage had 2 seats, and the top was like a square umbrella with fringe around the edges. It was called a phaeton, and if you think that's a funny name, all I can say is that it was a very funny carriage. The animals laughed like anything when they saw it, Hank pulling it out of the dump heap, and Mrs. Wiggins laughed so hard that she had to lie down in the middle of all the old tin cans. But when Freddy told them what they could use it for and how they could carry the gold back to Mr. Bean in it, they were very much pleased. The 2 dogs gathered together a number of things that they thought Mr. Bean would like and put them in the carriage. There was an old straw hat and an old overcoat and 2 pails, one full of red paint and one full of green paint. He can use them to paint the house, said Robert. And there was also a plaid shawl for Mrs. Bean. Then they were all things that people had thrown away on the dump heap, but the animals thought Mr. Bean could use them, and if he didn't use them, he could throw them away, and nobody's feelings would be hurt. Then they said goodbye to the goat. He didn't feel so bad about their going now, because he had a fresh wagon load of rubbish to look over, and had already found a lot of old boots to chew on. Then all the small animals climbed into the phaeton, and they started off. Robert and Emma and Jack sat on the front seat, and Freddy and Alice and Jinx and Henrietta sat on the back seat, and the 4 mice played tag all over the carriage for a while, and then they curled up in the bottom and went to sleep, and Charles perched on top of the square umbrella. When they had gone a little way, they looked back and waved goodbye to the goat, and he waved back to them. They could see him chewing away contentedly, and the ends of 2 old shoestrings were hanging out of his mouth. Chapter 14. Uphill and downhill the phaeton rolled along northward. Sometimes Mrs. Wiggins drew it, and sometimes the 2 dogs drew it, but whenever they went through a town, or were where they were meeting a good many people, Hank drew it, because then the people didn't stare so. Once when they went through quite a large town, Hank wasn't feeling very well, so Mrs. Wiggins put the rope over her shoulders and drew it for him. But the people all rushed to their doors and crowded round them and laughed so to see a cow harnessed to a carriage that Mrs. Wiggins got quite angry. I'm not going to have anybody laughing himself into a fit on my account, she said, and after that she would draw it only when they were on very lonely roads. They were all so anxious to get home again that they traveled faster than they had the way down, and it was not many days before they saw in the distance the white horse and the red barn where Hank and Mrs. Wiggins had been taken prisoner by the 2 men with guns, and there were the two men standing by the gate and talking. The animals stopped and looked at one another, and at first they didn't know what to do. Some of them thought they ought to wait until after dark, and then sneak by when the men were asleep. But the others were in a hurry, and as the men didn't have their guns, they decided to disguise themselves and try to get past. So Jinx got out the 2 pails of paint they had put in the carriage, and with a stick he painted Hank with red stripes up and down, and Robert with green stripes lengthwise, and Mrs. Wiggins he dotted all over with large red, green polka dots. He wanted to put some stripes on her horns, too, but she wouldn't let him on account of Mr. and Mrs. Webb. Then Jack, the black dog, got up and sat on the front seat of the carriage, and he had on the straw hat and the overcoat so that from a little ways off he looked like a very small man. And Freddy sat on the back seat with the shawl over his head. Jinx painted circles around his eyes so that he looked as if he had spectacles on. His own mother wouldn't have known him. All the small animals got into the carriage, hid under the seats, and Mrs. Wiggins walked behind, and Robert ran along underneath, and they went on towards where the men were. When the men caught sight of them, they opened their mouths wide and just stared. The big man had a pipe in his mouth, and it fell out to the road and broke, but he didn't even notice it. He just went on staring. Neither of the men had ever seen such an odd-looking animals before. "What is it?" said the big man at last, looking at Hank. "A zebra?" "Maybe it's part of a traveling circus," said the little man. "I never see a horse with red stripes before." "Who's that old lady in the back seat?" asked the big man. "She don't live round here, does she?" "Never saw her before," said the other. "Why don't you ask the coachman?" But before the big man could get up his nerve to call out to Jack, who did indeed look like a coachman in his straw hat and overcoat, the carriage went past him, and he caught sight of Mrs. Wiggins. "Great earth and seas!" he exclaimed, and both he and his friend jumped clean over the gate and crouched down behind it, shivering with fear. "It's a leopard," said the big man. "Look at the spots! A leopard with horns!" "Leopard nothing," said the little man. "It's a cow. Look at the shape of it." "I never saw a cow all covered with red and green polka dots," said the big man. "It's a leopard." "It's a cow," said the friend. "Maybe it's got some odd kind of measles." "If it had the measles as bad as that, it would be sick in bed," said the other. "It's a leopard." "Maybe it's got walking measles," said the little man. "I've heard of that kind, but it certainly is a cow." "It's not," shouted the big man. "It's a leopard." "It's a cow," repeated the little man angrily. "It's a leopard. It's a cow. A leopard, a cow." The little man was so enraged that he suddenly slapped the big man hard on the cheek, and at last the animals saw them, and the big man was chasing his friend across a field. "A cow, eh?" he was roaring angrily. "Don't you dare say that word again!" And they grew smaller and smaller and disappeared in the distance. As soon as the animals had gone 3 or 4 miles farther, they stopped and all went in swimming in the river that ran beside the road, to see if they could get the paint off, but it wouldn't come off. No matter how hard they scrubbed, Jinx sat on the bank and laughed and laughed. "You'll laugh out the other side of your mouth, young man, if I catch you," said Mrs. Wiggins. "You knew it wouldn't come off all the time." "It'll come off if you rub hard enough," said Jinx. "Yes, and so will my skin," snapped Mrs. Wiggins. "Enough. Anyway," said Jinx, "you can't catch me. Who's afraid of an old cow? Who—" But Robert had sneaked out of the water and come up behind Jinx, and just then he grabbed him by the neck. "I can catch you, though," he said. "Freddy, get the pail of red paint. We'll just fix Jinx up so he'll look as funny as the rest of us. Then we'll have something to laugh at, too." So Freddy brought the pail of red paint, and Robert held Jinx over it and started to dip him down. He only intended to dip him in a little, so that he would have a bright red tail. But Jinx began to wriggle and twist so that Robert lost his hold, and splash! Down went Jinx into the paint. He jumped out at once and ran around like a crazy thing, rolling on the ground and scraping against trees, but the paint stuck to his thick fur and he couldn't get it off, for the paint wasn't very deep in the pail, and he hadn't gone all the way in, so that the front part of him was black and the back part of him was red. And he probably was the funniest looking cat that anybody ever saw. From this time on, the animals attracted a great deal more attention on the road than they ever had before, and if the people had stared at them when they were just regular animals, they stared twice as much with all that stripes and spots with red and green on them. Some of the people were scared too. There was a tramp laying asleep one day by the side of the road, and just as the animals were passing him, Alice sneezed. A duck doesn't sneeze very loud, but tramps don't sleep very soundly, and this tramp was wide awake in an instant. He stared at the animals, and then he looked up at the sky and down at the ground, and back at the animals again, and then he pinched himself hard 2 or 3 times, and then finding that he was really awake, he gave one more horrified look, and with a dreadful yell, turned and ran. He ran so fast his feet hardly seemed to touch the ground. They saw him go up one hill and disappear over the top, and then in a few minutes they saw him very much smaller going up another hill way beyond, and he was running just as fast as when he started. For all I know, he may be running yet. I don't know that I blame him. But the animals did not like to be stared at, and they did not like to scare people, so they did most of their traveling at night. They would sleep all day, and then along about sunset they would take up and have a little something to eat and start out. They had some beautiful moonlight nights about that time, so that it was easier and pleasanter traveling by night than by day. The moon was like a great green lantern hung in the sky to light them on the way. Now and then a watchdog in some farmhouse would wake up and bark sleepily, and he heard them go by, laughing and singing and shouting to one another. They met very few animals or people on the road, only now and then a weasel or an owl out hunting, and all the time they were getting nearer home. Chapter 15. At last, late one night, they came down into the deep, dark pine woods where they had discovered the empty log house, and where they had found the bag of gold. Although the moon was shining brightly, it was very gloomy in the woods, and they were walking slowly, and not talking very much, because they were thinking how they were going to carry the gold back in the carriage, and how glad Mr. Bean would be when he saw it. They had almost reached the log house when Robert and Jack both stopped at exactly the same moment and began sniffing the air. "I smell tobacco," said Jack. "Not very good tobacco." "It comes from the direction of the house," said Robert. "Somebody's smoking." "All honest people are abed by this time of night," said Mrs. Wiggins. "Whoever it is up there is no good. Hank, you and I had better stay here, and the other animals can sneak up to the house and see what these people are up to." So Freddy and Robert and Jack and Jinx went very quietly up to the house. As soon as they got near it, they saw that there was a light in the window. "I don't like this," said Jinx. "I hope they haven't found our gold." "I wish the swallows were awake," said Freddy. "We could ask them about it. But let's look in the window." So they sneaked up and looked into the window, and there were 3 men sitting round the table smoking clay pipes. They were very rough-looking men. They wore caps pulled down over their eyes, and they all had revolvers and dark lanterns, so that the animals knew at once that they were burglars. On the table was a big heap of everything they can imagine: gold watches and pocketbooks and money and silver forks and spoons and earrings and bracelets and diamond rings. And they were all the things that the burglars had stolen from the farmers who lived near the pine woods. The biggest of the three burglars was dividing the heaps of things into 3 parts. "One for you, and one for you, and one for me. One for you, one for you, one for me." But he wasn't dividing them very fairly, for each time he said "one for you," he would pick up a small thing that wasn't worth very much, like a small spoon or a 10-cent piece, and put it in front of one of his companions. But when he said "one for me," he would take out a gold watch or a $10 bill or a jeweled bracelet, all set with diamonds, and put it in front of himself. But the other burglars were very much smaller men, and so they didn't dare say anything, although they looked very much discontented with their shares. Now the window through which the animals were looking was rather high up, as windows go, and although the 2 dogs and Freddy the Pig could see in by putting their forepaws on the windowsill and stretching their necks, Jinx was too short, and he had to climb up and hang on by his claws. He didn't need this particularly, because his claws were sharp and strong, and he could have hung on it like that for hours. But there was a big brown moth, who was also trying to look in the window at what the burglars were doing, and it kept fluttering round on the pane right in front of Jinx's nose, so that half the time he couldn't see a thing. At first he spoke to it politely, and asked it if it wouldn't please move up a little higher, where it could see just as well and wouldn't be in his way. "Move up yourself," growled the moth. "I was here first." "Of course you were here first," said Jinx patiently, "but you must realize that I can't move up, and I should think common politeness—" "Oh, shut up," said the moth. So Jinx didn't say any more, but he made up his mind to give that moth a lesson. So he let go for a minute with one paw and made one slap at the moth and scooped it right off the window. But Robert, who was standing next to Jinx, was doing something that all dogs and a good many people do. When anything surprised or interested him very much, he opened his mouth very wide, and when his eyes opened, his mouth seemed to come open too. So he was standing with his mouth wide open, staring at the burglars, and when Jinx hit the big brown moth with his paw, he knocked it straight into Robert's throat. Said Robert. "Oof! What's that?" said all the burglars at once, and they jumped up and bent over the table to blow out the lamp. But as they all bent over at exactly the same time, their 3 heads came together in the middle, crack, and then the light was out, and the animals couldn't see anything more, but they could hear the burglars rubbing their bumped heads and groaning. For quite a long time the animals waited for something to happen, but nothing did. The burglars were evidently badly scared. They seemed to be whispering together, and at last Jinx said, "I'm going in to see what they're doing. I noticed when we came up to the house that the door was open a little, and I think I can get in." So he went round to the door, and sure enough, it was open a crack, and he made himself narrow, as cats can, and slipped in. It was so dark inside that the burglars could not see anything at all, but Jinx could see them quite plainly. Cats can see in the dark. He jumped up on the mantelpiece to be out of the way and sat down. The 2 small burglars, whose names were Ed and Bill, were in a corner, trying to open one of the dark lanterns so they could light it. But as they never used the lanterns, but only carried them to show that they were burglars, they didn't know how to open it. The big burglar, whose name was Percy, was standing by the table on which were the 3 piles of stolen things that he had been dividing up, and he was feeling with his fingers in the other piles and taking out the biggest things and putting them in his own pile. But he couldn't see what he was doing, and pretty soon he knocked a watch and an emerald necklace off onto the floor. At that sound, Ed and Bill started up. "What you doing over there, Percy?" Bill whispered hoarsely. And Ed said, "He's after them jewels." "Oh, I am not," said Percy. "I was just feeling for the matches." "Oh, you was you?" said Ed. "Well, you just come over here and give us a hand with these lanterns." So Percy hastily stuffed a handful of $10 bills into his pocket and came over to them. "Why don't you light the lamp?" he asked. "We're perfectly safe. That noise wasn't anything." "Maybe so," said Bill, "but I'm going to take a look around with the lantern first. Here, see if you can get it open." They were all standing close to the fireplace, and as Percy took the lantern, Jinx, who never could resist a joke, reached out and dug his claws into his shoulder. "Ouch!" yelled Percy, dropping the lantern with a crash. "What'd you mean, sticking pins in me like that?" And he struck out with his fist in the darkness and hit Bill on the nose. Bill had just been going to say, "I didn't touch you, silly," but when the hard fist hit him, he changed his mind and flew at Percy, and in a second they were rolling on the floor and clawing and kicking and pulling each other's hair like wildcats. They rolled towards the table, and Ed, who was afraid they would knock it over and spill all the money and jewels on the floor, took a match from his pocket and scratched it on the mantelpiece, just under where Jinx was sitting, doubled up with laughter at the commotion he had caused. The match flamed up, and by its light Ed saw Jinx. Now, if you are a rather timid burglar, and you light a match in the dark room to see a cat that is half black and half red, for Jinx had been dipped in the paint pot, you remember. If you see such a cat grinning at you within an inch of your nose, you will probably do just as Ed did. He dropped his matches and let out an awful yell. When he yelled, Bill and Percy stopped fighting and sat up. "What's the matter?" they asked. "There's a red and black cat sitting on the mantelpiece and grinning at me," said Ed in a scared voice. "Fiddlesticks," said Percy, and Bill said, "Nonsense." And then he too lit a match. He was near the window, and as he did so, and there was Freddy the Pig, with his nose against the glass, staring in for all he was worth to see what was going on inside. Then it was Bill's turn to drop his match and yell, "A pig with spectacles on is looking at us through the window." For, of course, Freddy still had the circles round his eyes that Jinx had painted there. "Fiddlesticks," said Percy again, but he didn't say it quite as loud. And Bill and Ed didn't say anything. There was silence for a few minutes while the 3 scared burglars tried to get up enough courage to light another match. Then through the silence came the faint sound of wheels on the road outside. "Listen," whispered Percy. "Somebody's coming. I'm going out to have a look. It won't be black and red cats and pigs with glasses on anyway." And he slipped silently out the door. The other 2 burglars tiptoed to the road and peered out after him, but although it was bright moonlight outside, the trees were so thick round the house that they could not see the road. And then, as they waited, came a terrible yell, and it was 3 times as loud as Ed's yell and Bill's yell put together, and they heard footsteps running, and Percy crashed up to the door, his eyes nearly staring out of his head with fright. "Run, run for your lives!" he panted. "Out on the road there's a tiger harnessed to a carriage, and behind the carriage there's a leopard with horns, as big as a cow. Run, or we shall all be eaten up!" And he dashed off into the woods, and the 2 others dashed out of the door after him, and the animals could hear the crash of branches and the thump of heavy feet die away in the distance. And I may say that here they never saw either Ed or Bill or Percy again. Of course, what had happened was this. Mrs. Wiggins and Hank had got tired of waiting, and when they had heard the two yells, they had started down the road to see what was going on. They had not seen Percy come out of the door, and when he saw them and let out a terrible yell, they had been much too scared than he was. Instead, Mrs. Wiggins was quite faint and had to lie down for a few minutes by the roadside, while Charles and Henrietta fanned her with their wings. "I'm all a-flutter," she said. Oh my, oh my. Just put your hoof on my side and feel how my heart beats, Hank. What a dreadful experience!" But pretty soon she was able to get up and be helped into the house. The burglars had left all the things they had stolen behind them in their flight, but as the animals had no matches, and as it was late, they decided not to do anything about them until morning. So they all curled up comfortably on the floor and went to sleep.